Cersei Lannister stood at the window of her solar, watching the bright midday sun glint off the gilded rooftops of King's Landing. The Red Keep rose behind her like a silent sentinel, its red stone walls so familiar they might as well have been an extension of her own skin. She rested her fingers on the window frame and closed her eyes, breathing in the warm air that drifted up from the city below. It smelled of sweat and dung, of frying fish and spice-laden stews, all undercut by a briny whiff of the Blackwater rush. The sound of distant commerce hummed, 1,000 voices merging in a constant chorus of bargains, arguments, laughter, and the clang of iron. She had always been able to find a certain comfort in the city's noise. It reminded her that life went on, no matter the tragedies or triumphs within the Red Keep. Even as a child, she had found it easier to steel herself against her father's expectations by listening to the swirl of activity beyond the palace walls. The city was messy, chaotic, forever bursting with energy, so unlike the enforced order of House Lannister. On the other side of the window, the world continued as though the conflicts of kings and queens mattered little. In there, within the keep's stony corridors, everything weighed 1,000 times heavier than in the streets. She pressed her palm against her belly and thought of her father, Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, Shield of Lannisport, Warden of the West, and the man who had shaped her life with a steady, unyielding hand. So often she had chafed against his rule. All her life, she had felt overshadowed by the father who never truly saw her as an equal, who taught her to be proud, cunning, and fierce, but never allowed her to be as influential as she wished. It was not enough that she was regent for her young son, King Tommen. It was never enough. Her father sat the council chambers, commanded the respect of lords, made alliances, decided whom she would marry. He even determined her children's futures. Tywin Lannisters will reign supreme, and it always would. Or so he believed. Cersei opened her eyes again. Something in her had begun to shift after Joffrey's death, and the subsequent humiliations. Tyrion's trial for regicide, the whispers that she had orchestrated the Boy King's poisoning herself, the helplessness she felt when Tywin continued to show favor to Margaery Tyrell, arranging Tommen's marriage, forging alliances that enhanced his own power, never hers. Tywin treated her like an expendable piece in his game, a pawn that existed purely for forging dynastic ties. She despised him for his arrogance, for the way he spoke to her as though she were still a foolish child. He put an end to every notion she had of independence, using his quiet, unshakable logic to box her in. And she had endured. She had survived King Robert's dismissals and drunken rages. She had survived the sham that was her marriage and had endured for the sake of her children. But after the tragedies that befell her eldest boy, after the trial that ended with Oberyn Martell's grotesque death, she felt the coil of her patience unwind. The tension in her chest had stretched too far. The father who had once seemed like the only unassailable fortress of House Lannister was no longer untouchable in her eyes. He was simply a man, and men could bleed. That realization had first come to her in a dream, though Cersei did not call it a dream. She named it insight or perhaps prophecy. In that dream, she stood in the silent corridors of the Red Keep, a golden dagger in her hand, the weight of it far greater than it looked. Ahead of her, Tywin Lannister turned, his face expressionless. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, and then she advanced on him. The dream sensation was so vivid, every detail vibrant and warm, as though she were truly living it. When she awoke, her heart was hammering. She found a strange sense of possibility stirring in her. The idea had arrived unbidden, and once lodged in her mind, it refused to depart. She told no one of it. Not Jaime, not Qyburn, not even her own thoughts dared to linger on it for too long. But that idea that she might solve so many problems by removing one man nagged at her every waking hour. Tywin's hold over her, over all of King's Landing, was stifling. Tyrion might have been the twisted dwarf she loathed with every fiber of her being, but in killing Tywin, he had almost done her a favor in that other world she had sometimes imagined, except that was not how events had transpired. Tyrion was locked in the dungeon. Execution was no doubt coming, or perhaps some last-minute scheme would see him carried away. She didn't know, but she knew that she could not wait for Tyrion to act. She had to act herself. In the days following Oberyn's death, and leading up to Tyrion's sentencing, Tywin had taken possession of every major decision regarding the Lannister family. He was the hand of the king in all but name, the guiding force behind Tommen's every royal decree. Cersei was permitted to attend council meetings and to share her opinion, but the final word was never hers. The final word was his. She began to watch him as she had never watched him before. A new kind of scrutiny colored her gaze. Where once she had sought to please him, or to gauge whether he was satisfied with her performance, now she looked for weaknesses. She observed how often he seemed tired after long sessions with the small council. He was getting older. Lines of weariness deepened around his eyes. She observed how he would sip his wine with a slow, deliberate motion, his lips tightening at the taste if the vintage was not up to his standards. She saw how he used the privy chamber every morning at dawn, so punctual it was almost predictable. And she learned. Days passed, and the plan took shape in her mind. She could not storm his chambers with guards in tow, no. She could not publicly accuse him, for that would do nothing but bring the realm crashing down upon her. If she was to be rid of her father, it had to be in secret, an act so swift that no one could point a finger at her without sounding mad. She considered poison first, an easy method, one that would arouse suspicions perhaps, but it was safer for a woman with everything to lose. And yet, something in her balked at letting him slip away easily. A part of her wanted Tywin to look her in the eyes and understand. She wanted him to know, in his final breaths, who had triumphed. So she decided it would be steel, a small blade hidden in the folds of her gown. If she was quick enough, if she found him at his most vulnerable, she believed she could manage it. The question was how to escape discovery. King's Landing was full of watchers. Lords, knights, the King's Guard, Lannister guardsmen, gossiping servants, and master spies lurking in the shadows. She needed a moment of true privacy, and she needed to ensure that Tywin, cunning as he was, did not leave a final clue that would damn her. Cersei thought of her father's daily routine. He was always up with the dawn. Before the first council meeting, he would retire to his private solar or to the privy chamber. She remembered hearing Tyrion jest about their father's punctual bowels, but it was no jest. Tywin was a man of unbreakable habits. If she approached him there, in that cramped space where no one dared intrude, she might be able to catch him off guard, close the door, and do what must be done. It was a disgusting notion in a disgusting place, but it was also perfect. Tywin would never expect it. He would never believe his golden daughter capable of sinking so low. She did not sleep well in the nights before she put her plan into action. She found herself pacing the corridors, flinching at the sight of any Lannister guard. Was her mind showing on her face? If Qyburn or Pycelle guessed something was amiss, they might pry. If Jaime suspected, he would surely try to dissuade her. It was better he remain ignorant. Better that no one know. On the third morning after her decision crystallized, she dressed carefully in a gown of crimson silk, embroidered with lions in gold thread. She chose it because it had long, loose sleeves that easily concealed the dagger strapped to her forearm. She fixed her hair in an elaborate pile of curls, pinned with rubies, to distract the eye from her arms and shoulders. When she had finished, she stared at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked every inch the regal queen she had always longed to be. She tightened her jaw. Soon, she would be more than just a figurehead. She would be the true power in King's Landing. The morning air was crisp as she left her chambers. Dawn was just breaking, pink light spilling into the Red Keep's corridors. She walked with measured steps toward Tywin's private apartments, ignoring the yawning servants and bleary-eyed guards. Some bowed, some curtsied. She gave them only a quick glance. No one thought it odd for the Queen Regent to pay an early visit to her father, the Hand of the King. Indeed, Tywin had trained everyone to think it quite normal for Lannisters to hold council at any hour. When she reached the door that led to Tywin's private solar, she paused. Beyond it, a narrow corridor connected to an antechamber, then Tywin's bedchamber, and finally a small privy chamber. She could hear nothing yet, no movement, no voices. Swiftly, she opened the door and stepped inside, pushing it shut behind her. She stood there, in the quiet corridor, her heart pounding. The hush was absolute. She listened. If Tywin was already up, he might be in his solar, but if he was sticking to his usual routine, he would pass through here to the privy soon enough. Her gaze flicked to the door of his bedchamber. It was closed. She dared not barge in there. The old man might be sitting at his desk, fully alert. She needed him alone, off his guard. So she waited. Long moments dragged by, and she could feel the sweat gathering at the base of her neck, threatening to ruin the carefully pinned curls. She forced steady breaths through her nose. She reminded herself. She was Cersei of House Lannister. She was the lioness, the mother of the king. Fear was beneath her, but never had she been so close to drawing blood from a person who had loomed so large in her life. At last, she heard a faint scrape of wood against stone. A door within the bedchamber opened. Heavy footsteps approached. A flicker of a candle or perhaps a single lantern's glow moved under the crack of the door. She stepped back, pressing herself to the wall, shielded by shadows. She glimpsed Tywin's tall, imposing figure as he emerged into the corridor. Even in the weak dawn light, he was unmistakable. He wore his usual austere robes, black with gold fastenings, his white hair neatly combed back. He moved with deliberate purpose, like a man who had 1,000 tasks to accomplish before the day was done and would accomplish them all without fail. He walked past her hiding place, never looking aside. She saw the faint stoop of his shoulders. He was not as straight-backed as he once was. In that moment, he seemed less a titan and more a mortal man. She felt a savage thrill crackle through her. He was heading for the privy. Perfect. Careful to keep a few steps behind, she followed. He entered the small chamber, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Cersei waited, swallowing hard. She glanced at the corridor leading back to Tywin's solar. No one came. The hush in these private rooms was broken only by her father's faint shifting within the privy. This is madness, she thought. If I do this, there is no turning back. But she had decided. She stepped forward, placed her hand on the door latch, and silently slid it open. She found Tywin seated, his back to her, the low flicker of a single candle lighting the cramped space. The smell of old incense hung in the air, a courtesy, perhaps, to mask more unpleasant scents. Cersei stepped inside quickly and shut the door, pressing her weight against it. Tywin turned his head, startled. "Cersei?" he said. His voice touched with annoyance more than alarm. "What are you?" His words died on his tongue the instant she pulled the dagger from her sleeve. She saw the flicker of confusion in his green-flecked eyes, so much like her own. Then came anger. He shifted to stand, to rise in command of the situation, but she was faster. She lunged, pressing the blade to his throat, forcing him back. He was trapped, half-seated, half-risen. He tried to speak, but she pressed the dagger's point against his skin. A bead of blood welled there, bright as a ruby. They stared at each other in the guttering light. Cersei's hand shook slightly, but she did not back away. Her father's expression was a complex blend of wrath, disbelief, and something else, an uncertain recognition that perhaps his last illusions of control were crumbling. "Cersei," he said carefully, in a hushed, knife-edged tone. "Put that down." A tremor ran through her. How many times had he used that voice, ordering her about like a child? She held her ground. "No," Tywin frowned. "You are making a grave mistake." She let out a mirthless laugh. "As if you've never made mistakes. Allowing Joffrey to become the monster he was. Believing Tyrion was behind everything, always, and never giving me what was mine to take. You taught me to be ruthless, father. You taught me a Lannister must be feared. And you never once thought that your lessons would turn on you." His gaze darted from the blade to her face. She saw no fear, not yet. He was too proud to be afraid. But he was uncertain, and that was enough. "Think about the consequences," he said. "For the realm, for your son. They cannot survive if you cause the downfall of House Lannister. You will only tear us apart." She pressed closer. Don't patronize me. You've been tearing us apart for years. All in the name of Lannister glory, all to feed your own pride. I am done being your pawn." With a sudden burst of strength, Tywin lunged to knock the dagger aside. But she had expected that. She twisted the blade free from his grasping hand, raking it across his knuckles. He let out a hiss of pain. Then her other hand came up, slamming hard into his chest, shoving him back onto the seat. He grunted, the fight in him bristling. They struggled for a heartbeat. He was strong still, but she had the advantage of surprise, and the small space kept him off balance. She saw a flash of something like panic in his eyes then, a fleeting understanding that she might truly kill him, that she would. He opened his mouth, perhaps to call for guards, but she slammed the pommel of the dagger into his jaw. His head knocked back against the privy's wooden paneling with a crack. Heart pounding wildly, she could not stop now. She drew the blade across his throat in a single, swift motion. Blood spattered her hand, warm and slick. Tywin Lannister's eyes went wide. For a moment he made no sound, only a gurgling rasp, a desperate attempt to breathe. He lifted a hand to his throat, trying to stem the flow. Cersei stepped back, breathing hard. A wave of dizziness swept over her, but she held firm. She watched Tywin's face twist in surprise, in anger, and at last in something close to horror. He tried to speak, but only a wet, choking sound emerged. Then his gaze blurred, and he slumped forward. The candlelight played across his pale features, and for an instant, the lines on his face, the silver of his hair, were thrown into stark relief. He seemed an old, defeated man, just that. His breath rattled in his throat for a few seconds more, and then he went utterly still. Cersei stood there, dagger in hand, staring at her father's lifeless body. Blood was spreading across his black robe, dripping to the floor. She felt her heart lurch, though she could not say if it was triumph or terror. She took a shaky breath. It was done. Tywin Lannister, the greatest power in all the Seven Kingdoms, was dead, and she, Cersei Lannister, had killed him. She needed to move quickly now. If she were found here with the body, there would be no escaping the consequences. Yet there was a plan. She had formulated it on many sleepless nights. She reached beneath her skirts and removed a small pouch of salt and soap to scrub some of the blood from her hands. She could not clean everything, but she could at least lessen the evidence. She wiped her blade on a scrap of cloth she had brought for the purpose and then tucked it back into its sheath, hidden among the folds of her gown. She spared one last glance at Tywin's body. She could not disguise the cause of death. It was obviously murder by blade, but she might craft another story if she handled the next steps properly. Perhaps she could suggest an intruder, an assassin from Dorne seeking revenge for Oberyn Martell, or a faceless killer from Braavos. King's Landing was full of potential villains. She only had to redirect suspicion away from herself. She opened the door, peered out into the corridor, and found no one there. She closed the door from the outside so it looked as though it was still latched, prayed that no one would open it for a short while longer, and hurried away with as much composure as she could muster. Each step felt as if it reverberated through her entire body, but she forced herself not to run. She managed to reach her own chambers without encountering anyone but a few servants who barely met her gaze. Once inside, she locked the door, stripped off her gown, and balled it up. There was blood on the sleeves, too much to be explained by a simple nosebleed or a cut finger. She needed to burn the garments. She needed fresh clothes and a calm facade for whatever was to come next. She rang for her handmaid, Dorcas, and told her that she had spilled some wine on her dress during an early meeting, demanding that it be destroyed at once. Dorcas complied, eyes downcast, and left with the bundle, presumably to the furnace deep in the Red Keep's underbelly. Cersei stood at her mirror again, in her shift. Her reflection looked pale. She bit her lip hard enough to draw a drop of blood, then tore her gaze away from her own eyes. The deed was done, but it would be discovered soon. Tywin's attendants would eventually notice his absence, or come to fetch him for the council meeting. She needed to appear horrified and shocked when the news reached her. The perfect daughter, unaware of the tragedy until that very moment. No matter how tightly she tried to wrap herself in composure, she felt her heart flutter with something akin to exhilaration. He was gone. That immense shadow that had loomed over her life for so long was removed. Now she could guide Tommen as she saw fit. She would take charge of the small council, of the entire realm if need be. Marjorie Tyrell would not push her aside. The Tyrells would not overshadow House Lannister. Not while she breathed. That morning, as dawn gave way to full day, Cersei was found pacing her solar, frowning over a scroll, when one of her father's servants rushed in. He was breathless, eyes wide with panic, and declared that Lord Tywin was dead, murdered. Cersei allowed the scroll to fall from her hands as she clutched at her chest. She demanded details, her voice trembling in a perfect performance of shock. The servant stammered out the details, or what little he knew. The old man had been found in the privy, his throat slit, a dagger wound that looked vicious and personal. None had heard him cry out. It must have been done swiftly and with precision. Cersei sank into a chair, pressing a hand to her mouth, feigning devastation. She ordered the guards to seal off the corridors, to find any intruder who might have slipped in or out. She conjured tears, letting them streak her cheeks, while inwardly she felt only a cold, bright sense of clarity. A monstrous guilt stirred at the edges of her mind, but she pushed it aside. This was necessity. Soon after, she summoned Jaime and told him what she had learned. Jaime's face went white, shock and grief contorting his features. He left at once to see the body. She forced herself to remain behind, telling him that she could not bear to look upon their father in that state. She had always known Jaime to love their father in his own conflicted way, despite how Tywin had arranged Jaime's entire life as well. A small pang of worry nipped at her. Would Jaime suspect her? She felt certain he would never conceive of her actually stabbing their father in cold blood. That was the advantage. For all his devotion to her, Jaime was often blinded by his illusions of who she was, or who he wanted her to be. Chaos soon spread throughout the Red Keep. Kevan Lannister was summoned, his face grim. Pycelle waddled around, half in tears, shocked at the loss of the man who had commanded so much respect. Mace Tyrell paled and tried to salvage some sort of official decorum, but the other members of the council were in disarray. The King's Guard doubled their patrols. Rumors flew. Some said it was Tyrion's doing, that he had escaped his cell and taken revenge. Others whispered that Oberyn Martell's allies had struck from beyond the grave. A few pointed to the Iron Bank of Bravos, or even Stannis Baratheon's mysterious Red Priestess. Cersei listened to each rumor, carefully, weaving her reaction to encourage the ones she found most plausible. Let suspicion swirl and multiply. If no single theory gained dominance, no single theory would hold. Meanwhile, she worked to ensure Tyrion remained locked in the deepest cells with no chance of freedom. If suspicion fell on him too heavily, well, that was no real threat to her, except that she had not decided whether to see him executed for Joffrey's death, or if she could wring some advantage from him first. As the sun set on the day of Tywin's death, the Red Keep seemed a fortress under siege, though the threat was invisible. Servants moved in groups, afraid to wander alone, and the Lannister guards were everywhere, searching for a phantom assassin. Cersei called for the small council to gather that evening, though she did so under the guise of mourning. She wore black, her eyes rimmed with red from artificially induced tears. In the council chamber, she took her father's seat, the seat of the hand of the king, without waiting for anyone else to speak. That small, symbolic gesture drew glances from the others. Pycelle was so distraught he barely seemed to notice. Kevan tightened his jaw but said nothing. Mace Tyrell cleared his throat uncomfortably. Ser Harry's SWYFT and Grand Maester Pycelle both looked hesitant to question her. Cersei addressed them in a subdued voice, laced with her practiced sorrow. She declared that they must find the assassin who had so cruelly taken Tywin's life. She expressed her confidence that House Lannister would remain strong, that the realm would not see them falter. She was still regent, Tommen was still king, and she had every intention of maintaining the stability her father had built. She assured Mace Tyrell that his daughter's marriage to Tommen would proceed as planned, There would be no delay. Any hint of division or weakness could spur unrest. And now, more than ever, House Lannister needed its allies. When the meeting concluded, Cersei was the last to stand. Kevin approached her, his posture stiff. She looked at him calmly, waiting for him to speak. "Niece," he said quietly, "I cannot say what I feel tonight. We have lost the great lion of our house." She inclined her head, letting a few tears glimmer in her eyes. "Yes, uncle. I feel it keenly." He studied her face. Kevin had always been a straightforward man, without Tywin's cold cunning, but not without intelligence. "Have you any notion who might have done this?" he asked, voice hoarse. "Do you truly suspect Tyrion?" She let her gaze fall. "I suspect many things of Tyrion, but I do not see how he could have escaped his cell. I think it far more likely we have an intruder in the Red Keep, or one who bribed the guards. But we shall leave no stone unturned." Kevin studied her, then slowly nodded. "Of course. Be careful, my lady. Until we know the truth, none of us are safe." She waited until he had gone before allowing herself a long exhalation. Kevin's scrutiny unsettled her slightly, for he was not as pliable as Pycelle or as gullible as Mace Tyrell. Still, it was no matter. He had no proof and she would give him none. In the following days, the city buzzed with the news. Tywin Lannister had been slain in the Red Keep itself, an unforgivable affront to the power of House Lannister. Cersei put a bounty on the head of any rumored assassin. She commanded the city watch to conduct stringent sweeps, questioning anyone who looked remotely suspicious. She even arranged for an official statement blaming a possible Dornish assassin. The Martells, after all, had ample motive to strike back at the Lannisters for Oberyn's death. It was a narrative the public seemed inclined to believe. Funeral rites for Tywin were prepared with all the pomp and ceremony he would have demanded in life. Lord Tywin's body lay in the Great September of Baelor, dressed in the finest cloth of gold. His eyes were closed, and beneath the heavy paints and cosmetics, the wound at his throat was hidden. Torchlight flickered on the marble floors, casting wavering shadows. Thousands came to pay respects, or at least to see the dead lion with their own eyes. Guards in Lannister crimson lined the aisles, crossbows in hand, as though they expected another brazen attack. Cersei, robed in black, with her golden hair in a simple braid, knelt at her father's bier. She played the role of the grief-stricken daughter, her face drawn. Jaime stood beside her, silent and pensive, his expression unreadable. She had hardly spoken to him since the discovery of Tywin's body. He had spent much of his time pacing near the dungeons, presumably to keep an eye on Tyrion. Whatever his suspicions, if he had any, he voiced none. She glanced at Tywin's still face, illuminated by the surrounding candles. Even in death, he looked formidable. It was as if all his gravity and power had become trapped in that silent visage, refusing to fade. She felt a rush of conflicting emotions, relief, dread, and a pang of sorrow she had not expected. He had been her father, after all, and once, as a child, she had revered him. She remembered sitting on his lap, listening to him explain the complexities of Westerosi politics, the importance of their family name. A memory from a time before she had learned how he would manipulate every piece on the board, including her. When the funeral procession ended, the bells of the Great September tolled, echoing across King's Landing. Smoke from the votive candles hung in the air. Hundreds of watchers departed with hushed whispers, carrying gossip to every corner of the city. The realm had lost a titan, and speculation ran rampant about who would fill the void. Cersei made certain that her voice, as the Queen Regent, was the loudest and most assured. Yet behind her composed demeanor, the weight of what she had done pressed down on her every night. She dreamed of Tywin sometimes, dreams where he stood before her, silent and accusatory, or where she relived that final moment in the privy. Each time, she awoke with a start, heart hammering. But each morning, she rose, donned her gown, and carried on, because that was the only choice. Rumors continued to swirl around Tyrion, intensifying with every passing day. King's Landing demanded someone to blame, and Tyrion was an easy target. Even the rumor that he had hired a Braavosi cutthroat while in his cell circulated. It was nonsense, or so everyone said, but nonsense had a way of sticking in people's minds, especially when it served their prejudices. But Tyrion remained in the dungeons, heavily guarded. Cersei visited him once, out of morbid curiosity or perhaps a sense of finalizing her victory. She entered the cold, torchlit corridors of the black cells with 2 gold cloaks flanking her. When she reached Tyrion's cell, she dismissed them, insisting she speak to him alone. The dwarf was chained at the wrists, sitting on a straw pallet. He looked thinner than ever, with dark circles under his eyes. When the door creaked open and he saw his sister, he sneered. "Ah, my dear sister, have you come to deliver the good news of my execution date?" Cersei regarded him coolly. "I've come to see if you have anything to confess." Tyrion laughed. A hoarse, humorless sound. "Confess? To the murder of father, you mean? Are you truly as mad as the city claims?" "How would I manage that from here? Though I suppose you'd love to have me hanged for it. One less burden on your mind." She let the remark pass without reaction. She wanted to see if Tyrion suspected anything, but his scornful tone suggested he believed her as baffled as everyone else. "If you did arrange it," she said slowly, "I would see you torn apart, piece by piece." He gave a theatrical bow as far as his chains allowed. "You are too kind, dear sister, too kind." She studied him in silence for a moment, then said, "They say you hated him, but then I suppose we all did in our way." Tyrion narrowed his eyes. "You think I hate father more than you do? You, who spent your entire life trying to earn his approval, only to find he had other plans for you, again and again? No, I expect your hatred runs as deep, if not deeper. But you'd never dare." He broke off, brow furrowing. Then he shook his head as if dismissing a thought. "No, never mind." Cersei's heart skipped, but she kept her face smooth. "You were always suspicious of everyone," she murmured. "I wonder if it comforts you, thinking father might have died cursing your name." She could see Tyrion's own conflict in his face. He despised Tywin, and yet something in him was wounded by his father's death, or perhaps by the manner of it. He gave her a lopsided smile. "Oh, it comforts me well enough, though not as much as if I'd actually done it. Now, be a good sister and go away. Tell the headsman I'll be ready whenever you like." Cersei turned and left, her mind whirling. He was cunning, but if he truly suspected her, he would have said more. No, Tyrion was in the dark. She was safe. When she returned to her chambers, she found Jaime waiting for her. He stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames. At her entrance, he turned, his face drawn tight. "What have you done with Tyrion?" he asked. She approached, pretending a poise she did not entirely feel. "Nothing he does not deserve." Jaime's posture was tense. She could see his knuckles whiten against the hilt of the sword on his hip. "Do you really plan to see him executed for Joffrey's murder, now that father is—" He broke off, emotion choking him. "There's no reason anymore to appease father's demands. He's gone." She studied his face. "We still need to demonstrate strength," she said calmly. "A trial will take place. We have evidence. I don't see why we should show mercy to the imp who all but confessed." "He didn't confess," Jaime said sharply. "And you know it." She lifted her chin. "He demanded trial by combat, which he lost. The law is clear. We Lannisters must lead by example or the realm will think us weak. With father gone, we cannot afford such a perception." He shook his head, his expression warring with anger and disbelief. "Cersei, sometimes I don't know who you are anymore." She gave him a cool smile. "I am your sister, the Queen Regent, doing what must be done." A silence stretched between them. The crackling fire seemed louder than her own breath. She wondered if Jaime was close to breaking, if he might try to free Tyrion as he had once freed him before. If he did, she would have to treat him as a traitor. That possibility sent a chill through her. Jaime was hers, he always had been, or so she wanted to believe. But the death of their father had shaken him deeply. He lifted a hand, as though to brush her cheek, but let it fall before making contact. "You look tired," he said softly. She allowed a faint wry smile. "Do you blame me? All this talk of assassins and war, and no father to guide us. I'm exhausted." Jaime swallowed hard. "I suppose we all are." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Remember that we have each other. Father is gone, Joffrey is gone, but Tommen remains, and I remain. We must ensure our house survives, Jaime." He nodded, though his eyes held a flicker of sadness. "Yes, for Tommen." With that, he left her chambers. She stood before the dying fire, breathing in the scent of smoke. Already, she was making plans for how to maneuver Kevin and keep Mace Tyrell's ambitions in check. Her father's seat at the small council was now the seat of the Queen Regent. She would name a new hand of the king, someone pliable, someone who would not challenge her authority. If Kevin wanted the position, she might allow it, if only to keep him under her watchful eye. She needed to move quickly. The kingdom had enemies on all sides. Stannis Baratheon still loomed at the Wall or Dragonstone or wherever he planned to gather enough forces to strike. The Martells would be outraged at accusations that they were behind Tywin's murder, though ironically, that same accusation might prevent them from forging any open alliances. Who would trust them now, if they were rumored to have orchestrated such a bold assassination? She also thought of Littlefinger, safely away in the Vale, weaving his webs. She knew he might try to exploit this chaos in King's Landing, find a way to further his own cause. But if she kept a tight leash on the city, on the finances, on the coin and the alliances, she might outmaneuver him. Cersei Lannister had learned from the best, from Tywin himself. And now, free from his control, she would forge her own path. That same night, she gazed at the moonlight spilling into her chamber through the open balcony doors. The city glowed faintly in the distance, torches like little pinpricks of orange. She sipped wine, a better vintage than usual, letting its warmth steady her nerves. She thought of the future, of Tommen married to Marjorie, of the Tyrell alliance, of the forthcoming war with Stannis or any other claimant. The Iron Throne would remain under Lannister rule, and she would see to it that her son was safe and unchallenged. She imagined herself as the unstoppable force Tywin had always seemed to be. She would make mistakes, perhaps she had already made some, but she would not let them break her hold. She thought of what her father had once said, that the lions should never bow to any lesser beast. He had always meant for his children to be an extension of his will, to project his power across the kingdoms. Now his power was hers to wield, because he had taught her too well how to be ruthless, and he had underestimated just how far her ambition would go. When she closed her eyes, she pictured the moment the dagger bit his throat. She remembered the shock in his eyes, how quickly life bled away from him. A wave of conflicting emotions welled up, threatening to drown her. But she forced them back. She would not mourn him longer than necessary. Let the realm mourn him. Let the realm fear the name Lannister. She would stand unbowed. In the next weeks, as the rumor mill churned, she took the reins of the small council with a practiced hand. She confirmed Kevin Lannister as Master of Laws, carefully couching it as a gesture of familial respect. She assigned Ser Harry's Swyft as Master of Coin, a position left vacant after Tyrion's disgrace. Pycelle remained Grand Maester, harmless enough, though she kept Qyburn close, for he had proven useful in ways Pycelle would never stoop to. As for the position of Hand of the King, she allowed it to remain technically vacant, declaring that she would serve as regent and personally oversee the realm's governance while Tommen was still a child. "Your Grace," Mace Tyrell ventured in one council meeting, "if I may suggest that a more senior member of the council serve as Hand, it is a grave duty, and the realm might feel uneasy if it remains vacant." Cersei cast him a serene smile. "Lord Tyrell, your counsel is as valuable as ever. However, I do not believe there is anyone who can replace my father's role. Not so soon. The people love Tommen, and they know House Lannister stands firm at his side. Let them see that I am up to the task." Mace Tyrell nodded, though he looked mildly disappointed. He might have hoped to secure the position for himself or for one of his allies. Let him fume, Cersei thought. The Tyrells were valuable, but they would not control her or her son. To ensure the city's morale remained steady, she organized a grand ceremony for Tommen's wedding to Margaery. The ceremony would follow the usual period of mourning for Tywin, but not too long. She wanted no sign of weakness. Let them see splendor and wealth. Let them remember that the Lannisters were not in decline. She instructed the crown's goldsmiths to produce new decorations, new lion sigils encrusted with rubies, to adorn the city's main gates. She hired musicians, dancers, even acrobats for the festivals that would accompany the royal wedding. The coin for these indulgences was drawn from the royal treasury, what remained of it, and if that was not enough, well, they could always borrow more from the Iron Bank or the Tyrell coffers. She did not hesitate. A show of power was worth the cost. The day of the wedding dawned bright and warm, the streets of King's Landing thronged with spectators. Cersei rode in a carriage with Tommen, who was dressed in royal finery. The boy fidgeted nervously, but she soothed him, reminding him that his father would have wanted this to be a proud day for House Lannister. She wore a crimson gown trimmed in gold lace, her hair piled atop her head in a regal style. She smiled for the crowds, waving like a benevolent queen as the carriage made its way to the great September cheers and jeers mingled in the air. She noticed pockets of the city folks who did not cheer, those who had grown to resent the Lannisters for the high taxes and the never-ending wars. But overall, the city was drawn to spectacle, and the wedding was spectacle indeed. Inside the great September, High Septon knelt to anoint Margaery's brow with holy oil. Tommen stood with a mixture of excitement and nerves, glancing occasionally toward his mother for reassurance. Margaery was radiant in a gown of pale green decorated with golden roses, her hair woven with gold threads. She smiled at Tommen with genuine warmth, and Cersei felt a stab of envy, recalling how she had once been a young bride filled with naive hopes. Now she trusted no one's warmth. After the ceremony, bells rang out, and the new king and queen were escorted to a lavish feast in the Red Keep's throne room. The hall was bedecked with flowers, golden draperies, and towering tapestries depicting scenes of Lannister triumph. Laughter and music filled the space. Lords and ladies bowed to the royal couple. The aroma of roast duck, spiced wine, and honeyed pastries filled the air. Cersei circulated among the guests, making sure to speak with every important lord, bestowing sweet words upon them even as she measured their loyalty. Margaery, ever graceful, devoted her attention to Tommen, guiding him through the labyrinth of pleasantries. The boy blushed whenever she smiled at him, and the crowd adored their youthful innocence. Despite herself, Cersei felt a pang of protectiveness. Tommen was her last boy, the only piece of true innocence left in her life. She would do anything to shield him from harm, even if it meant orchestrating murders. She found herself at one point conversing with Prince Trystane Martell, who had been sent as a gesture of goodwill from Dorne. Oberyn's brother, Doran Martell, had extended a cautious olive branch, perhaps to quell rumors. Trystane was young, but seemed earnest. He offered sympathies for her father's death, though it might have been obligatory courtesy. Cersei responded with politeness, her face impassive. She could almost feel the tension coiling beneath their exchange, unspoken but present. The Martells were suspected. She had all but proclaimed it. Yet here he stood, bearing no sign of guilt. She wondered if perhaps Doran Martell was too cunning to reveal anything, or if in fact the Martells had been entirely uninvolved, which she knew they were. The irony nearly made her smile. Later in the evening, as the wine flowed and the music grew louder, Cersei excused herself from the revelry. She climbed a winding staircase that led to a secluded gallery overlooking the throne room. From there, she could watch the festivities unseen. Torches and lanterns cast a warm glow over the crowd below, and the Iron Throne loomed in the background. She saw Tommen laughing shyly at something Margaery said. The courtiers applauded as the couple shared their first dance. She looked down at all of them. Lords, ladies, knights, ambassadors, all swirling around in a ceaseless dance for power and favor. And she, above them, had placed herself in a vantage point from which to observe and manipulate. Once, she would have imagined Tywin standing in her place, guiding events from on high. but now that belonged to her alone. A sense of triumph fluttered in her chest. Tywin had always taught that family was everything, but in truth, it had always been Tywin's will that came first. Now, finally, her own will was set free. She clenched her fists on the railing, feeling the cool metal press against her palms. As long as no one discovered the truth, she would remain Queen Regent, unstoppable. A second thought followed. If, by some misfortune, her secret was revealed, the blow to her power would be catastrophic. But she had planned carefully. There was no one to witness, no shred of evidence but the suspicious timing. So many had wanted Tywin dead. She exhaled, letting the music from below wash over her. The viols, the drums, the pipes. It was all noise, glorious, triumphant noise to herald the future she intended to carve out. She would see her enemies crushed. She would see Tommen a strong and capable king, guided by her hand. She would see the Tyrells remain allies, not usurpers. She would face Stannis, Littlefinger, the Martells, and anyone else who dared challenge her. And she would do it all without the overshadowing presence of Tywin Lannister, because she had claimed that power for herself. When at last the feast ended, and the guests dispersed into the night, King's Landing remained ablaze with light. Torches lined the streets, and the revelers carried their celebration into the taverns and brothels. Cersei withdrew to her chambers, ignoring the swirl of gossip that followed in her wake. She could sense the city's curiosity, the speculation about the new shape of power. Let them wonder. She would not clarify her intentions until it suited her. As she slipped out of her formal gown and handed it to her maids, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished mirror. Her hair was slightly disheveled from the long evening, her cheeks flushed from wine. A small smile curved her lips. In that reflection, she no longer saw the timid young bride who had once wanted nothing more than her father's approval, nor the desperate woman overshadowed by King Robert's boorish presence. She saw a queen in her own right, a lioness who had tasted blood and found it sustaining. She dismissed her maids, letting them retire. Tonight, she wanted no watchers, no prying eyes. She walked to the balcony, the same vantage from which she had so often peered down on the city. The moon was high, silvering the rooftops. A warm breeze carried the sound of distant laughter. She rested her hands on the balustrade and thought of Tywin again, imagining how he would scold her for indulging in sentimentality, how he would insist that a Lannister should be in bed early, rising at dawn for the next day's battles. A sneer curled her lip. If his ghost hovered nearby, let him see what she had become. She was no longer his marionette. She whispered into the night air, "I have won." In the weeks that followed, Cersei's hold on King's Landing tightened. The War of the Five Kings had largely quieted, with only Stannis still pressing his claim in the north. The Tyrell alliance seemed stable for the time being, though Cersei mistrusted every sweet smile Marjorie offered. The Iron Bank rattled chains, pressing for repayment, and Cersei negotiated new terms in a flurry of letters, buying time with promises of future gold from the Westerlands. She also kept a cautious eye on her uncle Kevin. He had returned to Casterly Rock for a time, to ensure the seat of House Lannister remained in safe hands. She wrote him often, sending cordial letters that masked her vigilance. From what little she gleaned, Kevin seemed genuinely focused on preserving the family's strength rather than challenging her position. She did not fully trust him, of course, but she had no reason to remove him. Yet, the trial of Tyrion for Joffrey's murder was, in theory, still pending. But with Tywin's death, a general sense of confusion had delayed the proceedings. Some in the city whispered that Tyrion was likely innocent, pointing instead to the Tyrells or even Peter Baelish as the culprits behind Joffrey's poisoning. Still, Cersei refused to let him go. She kept him in the dungeon, had him fed just enough to survive, and occasionally visited to see if he would break. He never did, but the question of what to do with him lingered like a thorn. One day, as she presided over a small council session, a messenger arrived bearing urgent tidings from the Wall. Rumor spoke of unnatural threats, White Walkers, wildling hordes, and the dire need for aid. Mace Tyrell looked ready to scoff, but Cersei recognized that if the North fell into chaos, It might upset the delicate balance across the realm. She promised to consider sending reinforcements, though she felt little inclination to assist the Night's Watch. Let the North freeze if it must. Her priority was the stability of the crown's immediate domain. At the conclusion of that meeting, Cersei withdrew to the courtyard for a moment of fresh air. Servants bustled about, carrying crates and supplies. The Red Keep had become busier than ever in the wake of Tywin's death, as if everyone felt the need to prove their usefulness. She strolled through the courtyard with measured steps, her cloak trailing behind her. As she passed a corner near the stables, a hooded figure stepped forward. She almost summoned guards, but the figure raised both hands in a gesture of peace. She recognized Qyburn's voice before seeing his face. "Your Grace, forgive me for intruding." She allowed him to approach. "Speak." Qyburn lowered his hood, revealing a face half in shadow. "I have taken the liberty of examining Lord Tywin's final remains more thoroughly, as you requested." She stiffened. She had indeed asked Qyburn to glean any clue that might better direct suspicion away from her. And he bowed his head. There is little doubt the wound was inflicted by a sharp blade, probably from behind. The blow was well placed, no hesitation. Whoever did it was quite determined. There is nothing else to indicate the identity of the killer. She studied him warily. "And you have told no one of my interest in this?" "Certainly not. I merely informed Grand Maester Pycelle that I was examining the remains to confirm there was no poison involved. I suggested to him that perhaps you feared a new strain of the Tears of Lys." Cersei inclined her head. "Very good. And what do you suspect?" Qyburn looked her straight in the eye. "I suspect the killer was skilled, or else motivated by a great passion. Possibly both." She said nothing, let the silence hang. "I mention it because Lord Tywin's body did show signs of a struggle," Qyburn continued softly, "but not prolonged. Whoever attacked him had him at a disadvantage immediately. As for who in the city might manage such a feat, well, an infiltrator from Dorne or someone who knows the Red Keep intimately. But that is none of my concern, is it?" He offered a slight smile. Cersei's pulse quickened, but she kept her face composed. Qyburn was no fool. Perhaps he sensed her involvement, or perhaps he was fishing. She decided to address it head-on. "You have served me well, Qyburn. Continue to do so, and you will be rewarded." He bowed. "As you wish, Your Grace. I live to serve." With that, he slipped back into the shadows. Cersei exhaled slowly. A creeping sensation prickled the back of her neck. She would have to watch Qyburn carefully, as he was clearly too observant. But she also recognized his value. He had no qualms about treading paths Pycelle and other maesters would not. For now, she would keep him close, bribing him with promises of favor or resources for his ghastly experiments. Let him remain loyal out of ambition, as so many did. The weeks turned to months, and the realm settled into a tense lull. With Tywin gone, no immediate threat materialized in King's Landing. The Tyrells remained cooperative enough, though Cersei saw the subtle ways Margaery tried to charm Tommen, shaping him into a kinder king, sowing seeds of generosity. Cersei resented it but recognized that open conflict would only weaken her. So she bit her tongue, appearing warm and accommodating, all while she scoured every corner of the court for potential conspirators. Increasingly, she found solace in wine. Each evening, she would sip from a goblet, letting the burn trickle down her throat, relaxing the tight coil within her. She told herself it was only a small indulgence, a means to quiet her racing mind. But as her responsibilities and anxieties grew, so did her reliance on that liquid comfort. She felt sharper in the mornings if she had drowned her thoughts in wine the night before. Ironically enough, one evening, she sat alone in her solar, reading over a letter from Kevin regarding the Westerland's readiness for a possible conflict with the Ironborn. Outside, the moon cast a faint glow on the city. A half-empty pitcher of Arbor Gold stood on the side table. She had drunk enough to feel a pleasant warmth, though her mind remained alert. She reread Kevin's words. He was recommending that they reinforce Lannisport with more men, just in case the Ironborn raiding parties in the Sunset Sea grew bolder. She agreed in principle, but it was an expense. The crown's coffers were not what they once were, thanks to the wars and the extravagance of the wedding. Still, she would likely comply. She needed the Westerland secure, as that was her seat of true power beyond King's Landing. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She set the letter aside and called, "Enter." One of her ladies-in-waiting stepped inside, curtsying deeply. "Your Grace, the king requests your presence in his chambers. He appears distressed." Cersei frowned. Tommen was seldom distressed. He was a sweet-tempered boy, especially since Marjorie had helped him grow more confident. She set aside her goblet. "Very well, I will go to him." When she arrived at Tommen's chamber, she found her son pacing near the window. His golden hair fell across his brow, and the boy looked up at her with anxious eyes. Marjorie stood nearby, hands folded. She curtsied respectfully as Cersei entered. "What is it, my sweet boy?" Cersei asked gently, moving closer to Tommen. He bit his lip. "Mother, I've been having these nightmares. They're about grandfather. He looks angry and he wants something from me, but I don't know what. I try to speak, but I can't." Cersei's chest tightened. The mention of Tywin's ghost unsettled her, though she kept her composure. She placed a hand on Tommen's shoulder. "It is just a dream. Your grandfather loved you very much. He would not want to frighten you." Marjorie stepped forward gracefully. "I've tried to calm him, Your Grace, but the dreams have returned night after night." Cersei shot a thin smile at Marjorie. "I appreciate your concern, my lady. I will handle it." She turned to Tommen, stroking his hair. "Listen to me. Grandfather is at peace. He did great things for our family, and now he rests in the Seven's embrace. You must remember that you are the king, and no ghost can harm you." Tommen nodded, though he looked unconvinced. "Sometimes I see him in the privy, all that be blood, and I can't move. I wake up screaming." Cersei forced a soothing smile. "That is only because the manner of his death was so shocking. It does not mean his spirit lingers to harm you." Marjorie interjected softly. "Perhaps Tommen would feel safer if you spoke of Lord Tywin's virtues before he sleeps, or if a Septon performed a small ritual to guide his spirit to the afterlife. It might ease his mind." Cersei bristled at the suggestion, though it was logical. She did not like the idea of anyone interfering with her son's grief. "I will consider it," she said curtly. "For now, Tommen, try to sleep. I will have the maids bring warm milk with honey. If you wish, I can sit with you until you drift off." Tommen's face softened with relief. "Thank you, mother." Marjorie curtsied again, taking her leave discreetly. Cersei watched her go, a new flicker of resentment stirring. Marjorie was always so poised, so helpful. The realm adored her. Cersei saw it as a threat. She stayed with Tommen until he fell asleep, humming a lullaby she remembered from his childhood. As she watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, she thought about how vulnerable he was, how the burdens of kingship weighed on him, especially now without Tywin's guiding hand. She leaned down and kissed his forehead gently. "You will be a better king than Joffrey, my darling," she whispered. "Kinder, wiser." She exhaled softly. "And you will be safe, I promise." As she left his chamber, the corridors felt cold. She drew her cloak tighter around her, her mind drifting back to Tommen's nightmares. Tywin in the privy, all that blood. The image gnawed at her. She almost wished she could banish her own nightmares as easily as she soothed Tommen's. At length, she found herself wandering to the royal gardens, which were quiet at this late hour, only the faint glow of lanterns illuminating the paths. The air smelled of night-blooming flowers, heavy and sweet. She walked among the hedges, listening to the distant sound of wind among the leaves, trying to steady her thoughts. This was her kingdom now. Every choice she made would ripple through the realm. The memory of Tywin's murder was her burden to bear alone. She came upon a marble bench near a fountain. The water trickled softly, reflecting the moonlight. She sat, taking a moment to clear her head. A swirl of thoughts plagued her. Marjorie's increasing influence over Tommen, the need to fortify the coasts against Ironborn raiders, the threatened unrest in Dorne, the nightmares that haunted her son, Qyburn's subtle hints. For a moment, she closed her eyes, feeling the night breeze on her cheeks. A distant dog barked, and a horse whinnied from the stables. She thought of how large King's Landing was, how many souls looked to the Red Keep for leadership. Once, that leadership had been Tywin's firm hand. Now it was hers and hers alone. Could she do what he had done? Hold the realm together through cunning and fear? Perhaps. But what if her father had been right, that she was not as capable as a man in this vicious game? She clenched her fists. No, that was Tywin's poison lingering in her mind. She had outplayed him in the end, had she not? Her gaze drifted to the shimmering water in the fountain. She remembered the blood on her hands, the way it had spattered onto her gown, the hot, metallic smell. She had not faltered then. She would not falter now. A queen regent must be ruthless. A lioness must show her claws. She rose from the bench, smoothing her skirts, determination hardening her features. Tywin might haunt her son's dreams or her own, but she would not let his ghost dictate her rule. In the days and months to come, she would deal with every threat, uproot every challenger. Let the city whisper and gossip about who truly killed the great Tywin Lannister. Let them fear. When fear shrouded the truth, it served her interests. She would survive as she always had. And so, under the moonlit sky, Cersei Lannister walked back toward the Red Keep, her heels clicking on the cobblestones. Each step carried her further from the daughter who had once been overshadowed by her father's power and closer to the queen who stood at the head of House Lannister. By any means necessary. She had slain the Titan, and now all the lesser foes would bow before her, or face the same merciless end. That night, she slept only a few hours, but her dreams were blank, a dark void free of Tywin's accusing gaze. When she woke, she felt oddly refreshed, as if she had passed some internal threshold. She had killed Tywin. She had claimed her power. Now there was only the future to rule. In the days that followed, she solidified alliances, browbeat her opponents on the small council, and arranged for the quiet disposal of anyone who posed too many questions. Her father's death was woven into the tapestry of the realm's rumors. Some said it was Tyrion in revenge. Some blamed the Martells. Others whispered that Tywin had offended a dark sorcerer. The court fixated on the drama for a while, then moved on to other intrigues, as courts always do. Cersei rarely visited the spot where her father had died. The privy itself had been discreetly refurbished, the wooden paneling replaced, the floor scoured clean of blood. She had ordered it done swiftly, ensuring that no trace remained. She refused to let the memory of that moment linger in the corners of the castle, a permanent stain. Yet sometimes, in the stillness of the early morning, she would remember the exact feeling of pressing the blade to Tywin's throat, the tremble in her hand, the warm gush of blood. In those moments, she neither smiled nor wept. She simply acknowledged the cost of power, the price she had paid to seize control of her own destiny. Then she would rise, dress in her most regal attire, and face the day with a lion's roar in her heart. And so the capital's life went on, as it always did, swirling around the Iron Throne in an endless dance of ambition. The queen who had once been overshadowed now cast her own imposing silhouette. Whispers circulated that Cersei Lannister was more dangerous than ever, that she held the city in a grip of iron beneath her velvet gloves. Some admired her, some despised her, but all feared the consequences of crossing her. In the end, that was what mattered. Fear kept people in line far more effectively than love, Tywin had once said. She had learned that lesson well and improved upon it. She would combine fear with charm, cunning with cruelty, for she was the daughter of Tywin Lannister, and she would outshine her father's legacy or drag the entire realm into darkness trying. The memory of that final confrontation would forever mark her. But she would not be defined by it. She would be defined by what came next. The era of Cersei's rule, mother to a king, master of her own fate, a lioness who struck first before she could be caged. And should she ever feel a twinge of guilt or a pang of regret, She needed only remind herself of the many times she had been used, belittled, and cast aside by the very man whose blood she spilled. She had not only survived, she had triumphed. She had proven that a woman in Westeros could do far more than endure. She could shape the world itself. She had killed Tywin Lannister first, and in so doing, she had declared her independence from every cage he had ever built around her. Now, as the Red Keep bustled at her command, she walked through it with her head high, wearing her father's authority as though it had always been hers. King's Landing would soon learn that underestimating Cersei Lannister was the deadliest mistake of all. And in distant corners of the realm, where rumors traveled on the lips of bards and merchants, people spoke in hushed voices about the demise of Tywin Lannister and the rise of his daughter. Some said the Seven Kingdoms had lost a lion but gained a lioness even fiercer, and they speculated that the realm's greatest battles might yet be ahead. Through it all, Cersei never once let her mask slip in public. Each day, she solidified her rule, forging alliances, neutralizing threats, paying off or crushing any potential traitors. And each night, she lay in her bed, alone, sometimes drifting into uneasy sleep haunted by half-remembered dreams. But never did she doubt the necessity of what she had done. For she was Cersei, and the game was hers to win or lose. And so the story continued, the wheel of power turning in new, unpredictable ways, the shadow of a dead lion lingering only in the corners of her mind. She governed with the fierce pride of a woman who had claimed her rightful place, at a cost that she believed justified. Let the bards sing of Tywin's greatness. Let them lament his fall. In Cersei's eyes, that was yesterday's tale. Today belonged to her. If there was a reckoning ahead, a day when her every choice might be weighed, she did not dwell on it. She had learned that, in the Game of Thrones, one either won or died. And Cersei Lannister had no intention of dying. Cersei awoke the next morning, her eyes flickering open to the first glimmers of dawn bleeding through the heavy drapery of her bedchamber. A faint headache throbbed just behind her temples, no doubt the lingering result of the wine she had drunk the night before. The wedding celebrations had stretched into late hours, the whole city indulging in feasting and merriment. Even now, she could hear distant music drifting through the windows, the last of the revelers still carousing somewhere in the narrow streets. She sat up, pressing her fingertips lightly to her brow. Her bed was large and lavishly carved, fresh rushes upon the floor, velvet curtains drawn halfway to let in a bit of cool air. She noticed the rumpled spot at the mattress's edge where Jaime had sat hours ago. He had come to see her after the feast, still troubled, but she had been too weary to humor his doubts and uncertainties. As soon as he left, she had collapsed into sleep, lulled by the knowledge that she had succeeded in the single greatest risk she had ever taken. Her father was dead, by her own hand, and she was free from the crushing weight of his demands. It felt unreal at times. Some nights, she half expected Tywin's voice to echo in the corridors, summoning her to a cold lecture on duty and family legacy. But each morning, the memory of what she had done returned with crystalline clarity. She would have to live with it always, yet she did not regret it. Without that bold, bloody act, she would still be a pawn. Now the board was hers. Rising from the bed, she drew on a silken robe and crossed the chamber. Her bare feet brushed against the soft rug. She reached the balcony and pulled aside the drapes to peer out at King's Landing. The sky was a pale gray tinted with pink, and the city below already stirred with activity. Fishermen hauling their catches from the Blackwater, gold cloaks on patrol, vendors rolling carts to the bustling market squares. In the distance, she could see the great September of Baelor's white dome, glinting faintly in the growing light. Her father had lain there for days in his golden armor. Now, all that remained was the memory of his lavish funeral. The throngs had come to pay their respects or, in some cases, to feast their eyes on the spectacle of Lord Tywin's demise. It still felt bizarre to think how quietly he had died, cut down by his own daughter in the privy. She could almost smile at the macabre irony. He had been unstoppable until he met a death that was humiliatingly small and sudden. She turned away from the view and moved to the large wooden table at the center of the room, where a jug of watered wine stood near a basin. She poured herself a cup, sipped, and grimaced at the taste. At least it would dull her headache without making her so bold as to start the day drunk. She heard the soft scrape of the door and turned to see one of her maids enter. A mousy young thing with large eyes, named Felina or Felice. Cersei couldn't be bothered to recall precisely. The girl curtsied, avoiding her gaze. "Good morning, Your Grace," the maid said quietly. "Shall I prepare your bath?" Cersei waved a hand in brief acknowledgement, which the girl took as permission. She disappeared into the adjoining room to arrange the scented water and towels. Cersei sank onto a cushioned chair, letting her thoughts drift to the day's business. She would have to attend the small council meeting soon. There was always more to discuss. The Ironborn threat in the Western Seas, the unrest in Dorne, the financial demands of the crown, Tyrion's looming fate. She had no illusions that the tasks of ruling would be simple. Tywin's shadow might be gone, but the kingdom's chaos remained. She recalled Tommen's frightened eyes the previous night as he told her about his nightmares. Part of her wished she could shield him from everything, keep him as pure as possible. But she knew that was the dream of a naive mother. The crown required hardness. She intended to ensure he was safe, but she could not preserve his innocence forever. A moment later, the maid returned and informed her that the bath was ready. Cersei followed, shedding her robe to step into the steaming water. She let out a soft sigh of relief as the heat enveloped her muscles. The girl began to wash her hair, gently massaging her scalp with a perfumed soap. Cersei closed her eyes and allowed herself a few minutes of indulgence, inhaling the lavender-scented steam. When she emerged, she felt cleaner, calmer. She wrapped herself in a thick towel and regarded her reflection in a silver mirror propped on a nearby stand. Her face looked tense around the eyes, but her skin still held its youthful glow despite everything. She was no longer young, but she was still beautiful, and she used that beauty like armor. She smoothed back her damp hair and let the maid fuss with the pins and ribbons, shaping her golden locks into an elegant arrangement. She chose a dress of deep green velvet embroidered with gold thread, the color complementing her eyes. She admired how the bodice framed her figure, then set her shoulders back, ready to face the day. Word would come soon from her Uncle Kevin or from Mace Tyrell, no doubt. There were always letters to be read, alliances to be managed. The moment she stepped out of her chambers, she would be Queen Regent again, the entire court expecting her to hold them together. As she exited, she was greeted by Ser Meryn Trant, who inclined his head stiffly. "Your Grace, Lord Tyrell awaits in the council chamber." He did not say more than that. Ser Meryn was not a man of words. He was a blunt instrument, a club in the shape of a knight. Cersei found him useful enough. She followed him down the corridors of the Red Keep, her skirts swishing against the stone floors. Guard patrols were thicker than they had been under Tywin. She had ordered it so. The memory of her father's murder still hovered in the fortress, prompting extra caution. No one questioned her decision. After all, if Lord Tywin could be killed so quietly, why not anyone else? The council chamber loomed, its doors guarded by 2 gold cloaks who opened them immediately for the Queen Regent. Inside, seated around the massive table, were Mace Tyrell, Grand Maester Pycelle, Qyburn in his dark robes, and a few other minor council members who had replaced those lost to the war's attrition. Kevin Lannister was not present. He had returned to Casterly Rock to oversee matters in the Westerlands. Mace Tyrell rose from his seat, florid-faced as always, and swept into a clumsy bow. "Good morning, Your Grace," he said, his plump hands clasped together. "We have much to discuss." Cersei inclined her head, taking the seat at the head of the table, the seat that had once been Tywin's. Every time she sat there, a small, cold thrill flared inside her. "Let us begin," she said. "Where do we stand on the Ironborn situation?" Mace cleared his throat. "Ahem. My ships are patrolling the waters around the Mander, and the Shield Islands are on alert. However, I have received word that the Ironborn raiders have turned their attention to the coastal villages near Lannisport. Your Uncle Kevin has sent a raven requesting more naval support. Lord Redwine's fleet may be needed." Cersei drummed her fingers on the table's edge. "We cannot leave the Mander unguarded, not after the losses incurred in the war. But Lannisport must be secured. House Lannister cannot appear vulnerable. Kevin is correct that we need more ships." "Indeed," Pycelle mumbled, stroking his long white beard, "but we must also consider the cost. The Crown's debts to the Iron Bank cannot be delayed forever." Before Pycelle could launch into another wheezing cautionary sermon, Cersei raised a hand. "Spare me. The Iron Bank can wait. They have waited this long. They will not break the realm if a few more months pass without payment. Meanwhile, the Ironborn are a present threat. I want them subdued or at least driven away. If we let them run amok, the realm will see it as a sign of our weakness." Mace Tyrell inclined his head in agreement, eager to prove himself. "I can speak to my good father, Lord Redwyne, about providing additional ships, but he will want assurances, perhaps additional incentives for the Arbor's trade, or a promise that certain taxes will be reduced." Cersei smiled thinly. "Offer him what is necessary within reason. I will not have the Crown appear desperate, but let him know we value his assistance. Ensure that Lannisport is protected. The gold of the Westerlands is essential to us all." Qyburn cleared his throat gently. "Your Grace, there is also a missive from Dorne. Prince Doran expresses condolences for the late Lord Tywin and has restated his wishes for continued peace, though he alludes to the matter of his niece's inheritance." Cersei's eyes narrowed. "Myrcella, he wants my daughter on the throne of Dorne, or at least recognized as Arianne Martell's heir. Prince Doran did not phrase it so boldly, but the suggestion is there." Cersei tapped the table, considering. Myrcella was in Dorne, a ward of the Martells. She was safer there than in King's Landing, or so had been the original logic, an arrangement crafted in part by Tyrion in earlier days. Now, with Oberyn Martell dead, the Martells seethed with resentment, but Doran seemed to favor a more diplomatic approach. Cersei did not trust any of them, but neither did she want open war in the south. "I will draft a reply," she said. "We express gratitude for his kind words, reaffirm our commitment to Myrcella's well-being, but we do not grant any new inheritance or recognition. That can wait until Myrcella is older. If Doran presses, we will consider an alternative arrangement, but for now, we keep him hopeful, nothing more." Mace Tyrell looked as though he wanted to interject, possibly to propose some alliance with Dorne, but Cersei's tone brooked no argument. He shifted in his seat, lips pursing. She turned her gaze around the table. "What else?" A minor lord cleared his throat to mention an outbreak of pox in Flea Bottom, which needed attention lest it spread among the refugees. Pycelle nodded and launched into a droning explanation about quarantines and the distribution of potions. Cersei instructed them to handle it swiftly. Disease among the masses could breed unrest. The last thing she needed was a revolt sparked by hunger or plague. At length, the meeting wound down, and the lords departed one by one, bowing respectfully. Mace Tyrell lingered a moment, as if hoping for a private word, but Cersei pretended not to notice, letting the swirl of her skirts carry her from the chamber. He followed behind, then peeled off in the corridor to speak with some servant, likely about preparations for a feast or the next festival. Cersei found herself alone with Qyburn as they walked toward the courtyard. Sunlight streamed in through the narrow windows, and the sounds of the Red Keep's daily bustle grew louder with each step. She noted Qyburn's cautious expression, and though she disliked how much he reminded her of Varys at times, cautious, secretive, she acknowledged his usefulness. He spoke in a low tone. "Your Grace, I have continued my examinations of certain matters, as you requested." She knew what he meant. Any lingering hints or evidence about Tywin's death, anything that might point to her involvement or draw suspicion. She felt a flicker of unease, though she kept her face neutral. "And," he gave a slight shrug, "in truth, there is little left to examine. No one has come forward claiming to have seen anything. The gash on Lord Tywin's throat was so severe as to be instantly fatal. He had no time to cry out. The only rumor persisting is that Tyrion was behind it, or that an assassin from Dorne was hired to do the deed." No one of importance gives serious credence to alternative theories. She nodded. Good. Let it remain so. And should you hear of any whispers that might suggest otherwise, you will inform me at once. Qyburn bowed his head. Of course, Your Grace. One final note. There is a traveling septon who has been preaching in the city, stirring the poor to speak out against sin and corruption. Some call him the High Sparrow. He draws crowds in the streets, urging them to renounce worldly excess and chastise the wealthy. Cersei sighed, rolling her eyes. Another fanatic. The city always has them. If he becomes a nuisance, have the Goldcloaks chase him from the streets or lock him up on some charge. We have no time for righteous beggars. Qyburn inclined his head. As you command. With that, he departed, disappearing into a side hallway. Cersei walked on, descending the steps toward the main courtyard. The day had brightened considerably, and the training yard rang with the clash of steel. She paused briefly, watching soldiers practice with wooden swords. Across the yard, she spotted Bronn, a sellsword elevated by Tyrion in earlier times, barking orders at a cluster of young men. She wondered if he might be entertaining plans for Tyrion's rescue, but so far, he seemed too comfortable enjoying his new life to risk that. She turned her gaze to the stables, where a pair of Lannister guards were brushing down their horses. Beyond them, the gate leading to the city sparkled in the sun. Over that gate, a large banner of House Lannister fluttered, a golden lion on a crimson field, shining against the blue sky. She felt a swell of grim satisfaction. Let every man who walked beneath that banner remember who ruled the city. When she returned to her private chambers, she found that a new letter had arrived from Kevin, delivered by a courier who had ridden through the night. She dismissed the courier with a small coin and then broke the Lannister seal. The message was short. Niece, the Ironborn grow bolder. We are rallying what ships we can at Lannisport, but we need more support from King's Landing or Highgarden if we are to deter them from a full attack. On land, we have called banners from the Westerlands, but their muster will take time. If you do not wish to see Lannisport in flames, I urge you to send a fleet soon. The situation is dire. Kevin. Cersei frowned. It seemed the Ironborn had chosen a perfect moment to strike, sensing vulnerability in the west after Tywin's death. Her uncle was no alarmist. If Kevin said the threat was dire, then the raids were truly escalating. She thought of Lord Redwyne's ships and how valuable they would be now. The next step would be to pressure Mace Tyrell to make good on his promise. She would also have to consider dispatching some of the royal fleet, small though it was compared to its size under King Robert. For a heartbeat, she felt a pang of resentment. Had her father still lived, he would have conjured an army out of nowhere, hammered the Ironborn into submission. But Tywin no longer stood between the realm and its enemies. She did. It was up to her to prove that House Lannister remained fearsome. She poured herself a small cup of wine, this time a decent vintage from the arbor, and took a slow sip. The taste lingered on her tongue, warming her throat. She would have to act quickly. If Lannisport fell, the realm would see it as a massive blow, and the Lannisters' reputation would suffer irreparably. She could not let that happen, no matter the cost. She set the cup aside and summoned a scribe. The man arrived promptly, bowing. Cersei dictated a letter addressed to Mace Tyrell, urging him to move Lord Redwyne's fleet north along the coast to break the Ironborn threat near Lannisport. She took care to word it in a way that reminded Mace of the alliance between their houses and of the responsibilities that came with securing the crown's favor. She implied that if he were slow to act, the realm would remember. When the letter was sealed and dispatched, she felt a rush of satisfaction. She would not let the Ironborn humiliate the Lannisters. She would see them driven back into the sea. Perhaps, if the opportunity arose, she might even see the annihilation of House Greyjoy for their insolence. Balon Greyjoy was rumored to be dead by that point, leaving his heirs or relatives struggling for power. All the better, leaderless foes were easier to scatter. With that done, she glanced at a second letter on her table, this one bearing a small, neat script on the cover. It was from the Iron Bank of Bravos, no doubt pressing for repayment. Rolling her eyes, she flicked it aside. Let them wait. She would deal with them when she had breathing room. A knock sounded at her door. Ser Meryn announced that the king was requesting her presence in the royal gardens. A flicker of worry rose. Tommen seldom summoned her. Usually she sought him out. She nodded, dismissing Ser Meryn, and made her way to the gardens. Outside, the day was growing sultry. Bees hovered over late-blooming flowers, and gardeners trimmed hedges shaped like regal lions and rearing stallions. Tommen stood beneath a shady pergola, wearing a tunic of gold and red, though he looked far from regal. He wrung his small hands, pacing back and forth, while Margaery watched him with sympathetic eyes. Cersei approached with a polite nod to Margaery, focusing on Tommen. "My sweet boy," she said. "You summoned me?" Tommen took a breath. "Yes, mother. I've been thinking about what happened to grandfather. I keep having those dreams, and it's making me feel uneasy." Margaery suggested we might want to do something to reassure the people that we're safe, like a royal decree that the guards have everything under control. Margaery inclined her head graciously. "I only mentioned how the common folk still chatter about a murderer walking freely in the Red Keep. The city is anxious, even though the official stance is that an assassin from Dorne likely fled. Perhaps if the king were to make a statement." Cersei's expression tightened. "The more attention we give these rumors, the more life they gain. A statement would do little except remind people that Lord Tywin was slain in his own castle. That is hardly comforting." Tommen's brow knitted. "But I don't want them to be afraid. We can't let them think we're defenseless." Cersei softened her voice. "They do not think that. The city sees the gold cloaks on every corner. They see the Kingsguard, ready to protect the royal family. We need no further gestures. Trust me, Tommen, I know how these things work." He still seemed conflicted, but after a glance at Margaery, he nodded. Cersei suppressed a flash of annoyance at how he always looked to Margaery for approval. But outwardly, she kept her tone gentle. "Your duty now is to show strength by continuing your rule with confidence. The city need not dwell on old tragedies." Margaery dipped a curtsy. "Of course, Your Grace. I only wish to spare Tommen any more sleepless nights." Cersei regarded her. "I appreciate your concern, Lady Margaery." With that, she bent down to give Tommen a brief embrace. He leaned into her, clearly relieved, though his eyes still held a hint of worry. Cersei murmured words of comfort, all the while thinking, the only real threat is letting suspicion linger. But no one would dare point a finger at her, not even Jaime, not even Tyrion from his cell. And so the memory of Tywin's murder would remain a shadow, not a candle, in the corridors of the Red Keep. She left them to their stroll in the gardens. Margaery would likely keep Tommen company, perhaps read him some tale or feed him sweets from the kitchens. That was well enough. Cersei knew Tommen needed comfort, so long as it did not undermine her authority. The day dragged on as she attended various obligations, hearing petitions from minor lords, reviewing the city's finances with the Master of Coin, Ser Harry's SWIFT, and meeting with the captain of the Gold Cloaks to ensure order in the streets. By the time evening came, her head was throbbing from the sheer crush of demands. She retreated to her chambers for a brief respite, longing for a moment's peace. She was not alone for long. A firm knock on the door announced Jaime's arrival. She allowed him in, noting the grim look on his face. He wore his Kingsguard whites, which still fit him well despite the loss of his sword hand. His golden hair fell around his brow, and his eyes held an unsettled brightness. "Sister," he said, closing the door behind him, "I've just come from the dungeons. I spoke with Tyrion." Cersei sank onto her chair, swirling a cup of wine. "You insist on seeing him regularly. Has anything changed?" Jaime paced across the rug, his gaze troubled. "He looks half dead, but he still has his wits. He continues to claim innocence in father's murder." A sardonic smile touched Cersei's lips. "As if his claims matter. We both know Tyrion's cunning. He'd lie if it served him." Jaime stopped, frowning. "He asked me if I believed he did it. I told him I didn't know. He said if I truly believed he was capable of killing father from his dungeon cell, that I was a fool. Cersei felt a flicker of unease but kept her voice level. Tyrion always did enjoy calling others fools. Let him rot with his taunts. Jaime studied her. Cersei, are we truly going to execute him for Joffrey's murder when we have so little proof? Father wanted him dead, yes. But father is gone now. Perhaps it's time we show mercy. If Tyrion is truly innocent. Cersei's voice sharpened. Mercy? Did you learn nothing from Tywin's rule? Mercy is a weakness. One that lingers in the memory of your enemies for generations. Tyrion has proven himself an enemy of this family. Jaime's jaw tightened. But has he truly? He fought for us at the Battle of the Blackwater. He nearly died. He turned that victory into a demand for recognition and influence. Cersei shot back. He never hid his contempt for me or for Joffrey. I do not forget that he threatened me more than once. Jaime rubbed his forehead, frustration clear. You know I've never liked Tyrion much, but he is still our brother. We are all that's left of House Lannister in the capital. Cersei stood abruptly, crossing to Jaime. She placed a hand on his chest, looking up into his eyes with a determined glint. We cannot let sentiment blind us. Tyrion is dangerous. If we release him or if we show him leniency, it will only embolden him and those who might rally to his cause. If he has done nothing else, at the very least he's guilty of orchestrating Myrcella's departure to Dorne without my blessing, of defying me at every turn. Jaime's shoulders slumped. I don't want to see more bloodshed. This family has shed enough blood already. A cold smile curved her lips. This is why father never fully trusted you to govern. You have a soft heart, Jaime. We are dealing with power, not dreams. House Lannister's survival depends on crushing threats, not coddling them. For a moment, Jaime looked as though he might argue further, but then his gaze flickered away and he sighed. Very well, sister. I'll let the matter lie for now, but I won't be the one to swing the sword, if it comes to that. She tilted her head. I wouldn't expect you to. You're the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard now, and if Tommen commands Tyrion's execution, another man can see it done. Jaime turned and walked to the window, staring out at the city lights. The tension in his posture was clear, and Cersei knew that a gulf had opened between them. He had changed since his captivity and the loss of his hand. He was no longer the same golden warrior who had once matched her ambition stride for stride. She moved behind him, letting her hand linger on his arm for a moment. We will persevere, she said more softly. For Tommen, for the future of our house. Father would have wanted it. Jaime let out a weary breath. Would he? She didn't answer. Instead, she brushed past him, leaving him gazing into the night. She told herself it did not matter if Jaime doubted her. He had always wavered when confronted with moral quandaries, whereas she understood that in the pursuit of power, hesitation meant death. In the following days, Cersei pressed forward with her plans for the Ironborn threat. She cornered Mace Tyrell in the council chamber, forcing him to commit to sending a portion of the Redwyne fleet up the coast. Mace puffed up his chest, claiming it was already in motion, and Cersei pretended to be pleased by his initiative. Through letters to Kevin, she arranged for a combined force at sea, ensuring the Ironborn would be caught between Redwyne ships and the Lannister garrison at Lannisport. It would take time, but she expected results. Reports trickled in that some of the Ironborn had raided small fishing villages along the coast, burning huts and seizing what little gold they could find. But once the main Redwyne fleet arrived, they retreated, scattering like rats. Kevin's letters became more optimistic. He promised he would not let Lannisport fall and that the proud banners of House Lannister still flew untouched above the city walls. That small victory bolstered Cersei's mood. She was starting to enjoy this new role, truly at the helm, making decisions that would shape the future of the realm. Sometimes, she found herself thinking that perhaps she was accomplishing what her father had intended all along, except she was doing it on her own terms, without his hand on her shoulder. However, the city itself had begun whispering about the so-called High Sparrow. He was no mere street corner fanatic, it seemed, but a well-spoken holy man who drew throngs of poor folk to hear him preach. He condemned the sins of the nobility, the corruption in the church, the vanity of wealth. Men and women knelt at his feet, confessing their misdeeds in exchange for blessings. At first, Cersei dismissed him as a nuisance, but daily reports from the Goldcloaks suggested his gatherings grew larger. Some folks gave away their coin, shaved their heads, and wore rough-spun clothing to display their devotion to the Seven. The Great September was uneasy about his popularity, though the High Septon had not openly challenged him. A few Septas seemed enthralled by the High Sparrow's humble ways. One afternoon, she received a request from the High Sparrow himself, delivered by a soft-spoken young man in simple robes, who asked if he might have an audience with the Queen Regent. Cersei was tempted to refuse outright, but she hesitated. Publicly slighting a popular holy figure could inflame the commoners. Better to see him gauge his intentions. If he grew too bold, she could always have him imprisoned or quietly eliminated. She arranged a small, private audience in a lesser hall of the Red Keep. The High Sparrow arrived without fanfare, escorted by 2 Goldcloaks. He was a slender man of indeterminate age, clad in the plainest of robes, feet dusty from walking. His hair was cropped close, his expression solemn yet calm. He bowed respectfully. "Your Grace," he said in a soft, steady voice, "I thank you for granting me your time." Cersei eyed him. She had expected a ragged beggar, but he carried himself with quiet dignity. "I have heard that you gather large crowds in my city," she said, keeping her tone cool. "The people are easily swayed. I hope you do not intend to rouse them against the crown." He shook his head, clasping his hands. "My only intention is to guide the faithful to live in righteousness. We are all sinners before the Seven, highborn and lowborn alike. My sermons speak of humility, charity, and the moral duty of those who hold power." Her lips curved in a slight smirk. "Moral duty? Power is its own duty. We feed the city, we keep the peace, we build roads and walls. If that is not moral, I do not know what is." He did not flinch at her sarcasm. To feed the city is good, to keep order is also good. But sometimes, the trappings of wealth distract us from the compassion the Seven command. If your Grace would consider supporting the cause of the poor more directly, many would rejoice. A royal donation to the hungry or an act of penance might show the crown's humility before the Seven. Cersei's eyes flashed. She had no desire to be lectured on humility. The crown has many responsibilities. If you require bread for the poor, you might petition the master of coin, though you will need a far stronger argument than pious chatter. He dipped his head. "I ask not for gold, but for a recognition that the faith must be free to minister to those in need." The old faith militant, disbanded centuries ago, once kept the peace in times when the common folk had nowhere else to turn. Perhaps it is time we consider restoring some measure of that guardianship. She blinked, surprised by his boldness. "You propose that zealots with stars carved on their foreheads roam the city, enforcing the Seven's laws?" A gentle smile flickered at his lips. "Only if sanctioned by the crown, and only to aid in rooting out the worst sins, predatory moneylenders, those who exploit children or defile septs. Imagine, Your Grace, a realm where the faithful stand beside the crown to ensure morality." For an instant, she recalled how her father had once manipulated the faith with gold, forcing them to align with his policies. If she, as regent, could control a new faith militant, it might be a powerful tool indeed. A way to keep the commoners in line under the guise of piety. Still, caution gnawed at her. Religious fanatics could be unpredictable. She masked her thoughts with an indifferent expression. "A most intriguing notion, High Sparrow. I will consider it. In the meantime, see that your gatherings remain peaceful. If there is any hint of unrest, I will act swiftly." He bowed again. "I thank you, Your Grace. The Seven watch over us all." She watched him depart, half convinced he was just another humble fool. Yet something in his calm gaze unsettled her. He might appear meek, but he held the hearts of many. That was a power not to be underestimated, especially in a city prone to riot. Over the next fortnight, she continued to mull over his words. The idea of reinstating a faith militant was extreme, but if done carefully, it might bind the faith to her cause. She could direct their energies toward punishing her enemies, cloaking it all in religious fervor. But it was a risk. Once the faith was armed, it might not easily be controlled. She decided to delay any decision, waiting to see how events unfolded. She had other matters pressing on her mind. The news from Lannisport improved with each passing day. The Ironborn scattered, a victory that she could claim as her own accomplishment. She read Kevin's letters with a smug smile, noting how he praised the timely arrival of the Red Wine fleet. Even Mace Tyrell could not deny that the realm owed the Lannisters for halting the Ironborn's advance. Meanwhile, she made a public show of rewarding those who had supported the crown in this endeavor. Lords who pledged ships received small boons, extra titles, gold for their ports, or a seat at court. She wanted to cultivate loyalty, ensuring that rumors of instability after Tywin's death would be replaced by admiration for the new Queen Regent's swift action. During a quiet evening, as she sat in her solar reading over the day's dispatches, Jaime arrived once more, expression grim. She tensed. She could sense he was bringing her unwelcome news. He began without preamble. "Cersei, I've just come from the White Sword Tower. There's a rumor that Tyrion might attempt to escape." One of the jailers overheard a guard talking about potential bribes. Cersei's lips thinned. "Then have the guard arrested and questioned. If the threat is real, we'll catch everyone involved. I will not allow that monster to slip out of our grasp." Jaime nodded. "I will see to it. But I came here because I feel we need to settle Tyrion's fate. As long as he's alive, there's a risk. Perhaps you should proceed with the trial or pass sentence." She studied him. "Would you have me execute him now, without further ceremony?" His mouth tightened. "I am saying that leaving him to fester in the dungeons, half forgotten, is dangerous. Either free him or condemn him. You've not set a date for the trial, and the talk around the castle is that you're keeping him indefinitely." Cersei let out a humorless laugh. "Is that your advice? That I simply rid myself of the problem? If the problem grows, it may be beyond your control. Tyrion is cunning. The more time he has, the more he'll scheme." She rose from her chair, pacing across the rug. Her mind churned. Tyrion was indeed dangerous. He had once slipped out of the Ares' clutches on a technicality. His silver tongue and bribes might yet find a way. Perhaps Jaime was right. Maybe it was time to end the farce. Yet she hesitated. For all her hatred, a small part of her recognized that Tyrion had not truly been proven guilty of Joffrey's murder. He might be innocent of that specific crime, even if he was guilty of many others. Some corner of her mind whispered that executing him unjustly might provoke the suspicion she dreaded. People might wonder if she was punishing him for another reason. She frowned. "Very well. I will have Qyburn arrange for a final inquiry into Tyrion's guilt. If it is conclusive, he will die. If not—" She trailed off, not quite finishing the thought. Jaime folded his arms. "That's more decisive than the current limbo, at least." She approached him, laying a hand on his chest. "Trust me, I do this for our family's sake. Our father's death must not be overshadowed by more scandal. We must appear strong, united. If Tyrion stands trial, it must be swift and final." Jaime nodded slowly. "I'll ensure he remains secure until then." He left soon after, and Cersei was alone with her tumultuous thoughts. She rang a small bell, and a servant brought her more wine. She took a long sip, feeling the tension coil in her shoulders. Everything she did was a balancing act. Executing Tyrion too hastily might provoke rumors, but letting him escape would be far worse. A rational part of her mind wondered if perhaps banishment could be an option. Yet that seemed too lenient, and Tyrion in exile might return with Sellswords or some cunning alliance to torment her later. No, death was safer, but it had to be done carefully with a veneer of justice. While Qyburn prepared the so-called inquiry, Cersei focused on other affairs. She learned that Stannis Baratheon remained at the Wall, forging uneasy ties with the Night's Watch. Reports claimed wildlings were being let through the gates. If that was true, the North might be on the verge of a strange new conflict. She weighed whether to dispatch a raven to demand details, but ultimately decided that the North was too distant, its troubles overshadowed by White Walkers or other nonsense. Let them freeze. King's Landing had more immediate concerns. Days passed, and Margaery Tyrell's influence over Tommen continued to grow. She taught him to hold court with a more gracious demeanor, to smile upon petitioners. The commoners loved to see a king who seemed gentle, so unlike Joffrey. Cersei recognized the advantages of that, but she also saw how Margaery used every opportunity to endear herself to the people. She decided to pay more attention to the queen's activities. One evening, she appeared in the throne room as Tommen and Margaery listened to a group of supplicants, mothers whose children had gone missing in the warrens of the city. Margaery spoke soothingly, promising an investigation by the Goldcloaks. Tommen nodded along, sympathetic. The group left with hope shining in their eyes. Cersei stepped forward, noticing how Margaery offered a polite smile. "Your Grace," Margaery said sweetly, "the king and I are just finishing our final petitions for the day." Cersei gave an approving nod. "How admirable of you to assist Tommen. I trust all is well." Tommen looked up, trying to appear solemn. "We had some heartbreaking stories today, Mother. The children, I wish we could do more to help them." Cersei forced a gentle tone. "You have done what you can. The Goldcloaks will investigate, and we will punish any who prey on innocents." Margaery inclined her head. "The king has a kind heart, Your Grace, a quality the people cherish." Cersei met her gaze with an unreadable smile. "Indeed, kindness is a virtue." She turned to Tommen. "My sweet boy, if you are done here, I'd like to speak with you privately for a moment." Tommen rose, glancing at Margaery for a fraction of a second before nodding to his mother. Cersei led him to a small side chamber, lavishly decorated with tapestries depicting Lannister victories. When the door closed behind them, she settled into a chair and beckoned him closer. "How are your lessons?" she asked softly. "Are you growing comfortable with the responsibilities of a king?" He hesitated. I think so, Mother. Margaery helps me a lot, and the small council tries to explain things, though sometimes it's very complicated." Cersei reached out and took his hand. "Tommen, you must remember that while Margaery is your queen, your mother is here to guide you as well. If ever you feel confused, or if you sense that someone is pushing you in a direction you don't understand, come to me. Will you promise me that?" He nodded eagerly. "I promise, Mother. She's so nice to me. She never makes me feel stupid. I know Joffrey called me weak, but Margaery says I can be strong in a different way." Cersei resisted the urge to sneer. Of course she would say that. She wants to be adored by the people, and you, as the king, are central to that. "I only want you to see clearly. Trust her as your wife, but do not let her overshadow your own judgment." Tommen's expression grew slightly somber. "I won't, Mother. I'm trying to learn all I can. Sometimes I miss Grandfather. He was so strong." She gave his hand a squeeze, ignoring the sting of that word. "He was strong, yes, but you will be your own king, with or without him." She kissed his forehead and rose, leaving him to return to Margaery. As the days wore on, she repeated this kind of conversation with him, sowing small seeds of caution against the Tyrell queen. She told herself it was necessary. If Margaery swayed Tommen too far, she might undermine House Lannister in the long run. She had not killed her father only to lose her son's loyalty to a clever rose from Highgarden. All the while, Qyburn's so-called inquiry into Tyrion's involvement in Joffrey's murder proceeded in the dungeons. Cersei refused to sully her presence by attending the questioning sessions. Qyburn informed her that they were speaking to various witnesses, jailers, servants, old acquaintances who might recall suspicious words or bribes. She doubted any of it was truly relevant. The reality was that Tyrion had no champion now, and if the evidence was inconclusive, they could simply invent a rationale. She waited, balancing her tasks of governance with her simmering anticipation of the final outcome. Meanwhile, a new wave of rumors passed through the city. Something about dragons in the east, the Targaryen girl conquering slaver cities and freeing throngs of slaves. Cersei paid it little heed. Daenerys Targaryen was an ocean away, and if she ever managed to cross, Cersei would deal with her then. One evening, Qyburn arrived at her chambers with a thin sheaf of parchment. He bowed low. "Your Grace, the inquiry is complete. May we speak?" She gestured for him to enter, offering him a seat by the small table. The hour was late. A single candle lit the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She poured herself a goblet of wine but offered none to Qyburn. He did not seem to mind. "Speak," she said. "What have you learned?" He lowered his voice. "Very little evidence directly ties Lord Tyrion to Joffrey's murder, aside from circumstantial suspicion. He was present at the wedding, he held the cup. But we already knew that. None of the guards in the dungeon can testify that he left his cell on the night Lord Tywin was killed. Several guards swore they never saw him outside. As for the question of whether he arranged a hired killer, it remains purely speculative. The only real testimony we have is from a jailer who claims Tyrion offered him a bribe to deliver messages." She grimaced. "But no message was found?" Qyburn shook his head. "Nothing. Also, the jailer's reputation is questionable. He might have fabricated the bribe story, hoping for reward." She leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingernails on the table. "So you are telling me we have no solid proof that Tyrion arranged Father's death or Joffrey's death?" "That is correct, Your Grace. However," Qyburn added cautiously, "we do have enough rumor and half-truths to spin a compelling case for the public. If you wish to hold a trial, we can produce witnesses who will say they heard Tyrion speaking ill of Lord Tywin, voicing threats. We can also raise the matter of Joffrey's wedding, the details of the poison in the cup. For many, that is still enough to convict him." Cersei's lips curled. "And if we do convict him, we execute him as a regicide twice over if we claim he killed Joffrey and Father. That would be that. House Lannister would be avenged." Qyburn bowed his head. "Yes, Your Grace." She stared into the candle flame. Part of her longed to see Tyrion's head parted from his shoulders. He had always been an inconvenience and a rival. Yet, a small voice inside her whispered that if she executed him now, after such a long delay, it might raise more questions about Tywin's real killer. Would people wonder if she was silencing him to hide some deeper truth? She was not naive enough to think the entire city was blind. Some might already suspect her involvement, though none dared say so out loud. Killing Tyrion in a show trial might encourage whispers that the true killer was covering her tracks. But if she let Tyrion live, she risked him eventually finding a way to strike at her. She exhaled, leaning forward. "Qyburn, is there any chance Tyrion knows something? Something that could implicate me?" Qyburn shook his head. "I cannot say what Lord Tyrion truly knows, but from what my informants gather, he appears as confused as anyone about Lord Tywin's death." She thought of Tyrion's cunning, the secrets he'd gleaned over the years. If he suspected her hand in Tywin's murder, he might bide his time, waiting for the perfect moment to expose her or blackmail her. That possibility was intolerable. She lifted her chin. "Then the only safe course is to remove him. Ensure we do it with enough spectacle that the realm sees it as justice for Joffrey. Let the city dwell on that. I will not hold a grand trial like before. That fiasco with Oberyn Martell cost us dearly. Keep it brief. Summon a few witnesses, a small hearing before Tommen. Then we pass judgment." Qyburn inclined his head. "I will make the arrangements. Shall I inform the king?" "Yes, but softly. I will speak to Tommen myself first. He must be prepared to look solemn. It will be his first major decision as king. He must condemn his own uncle." Qyburn hesitated. "That is harsh, but perhaps necessary." Cersei offered a thin smile. "Tommen may not like it, but Marjorie's sweet words can't shield him from the realities of kingship forever. This is the price of ruling. Sometimes you must sacrifice blood for stability." Qyburn bowed again. "I shall see to everything. Good night, Your Grace." He left her alone with the candlelight dancing across the table. She sat there for a long moment, swirling the wine in her goblet. Her plan was set, and she felt a grim resolve. Tyrion would die, that final link to the meddlesome trouble of her father's ambitions, and any suspicion that might lead back to her would be gone. Yet, as she drained the wine, she felt no triumph, only a cold certainty. She told herself it was a necessary step, that her father would have approved. Tywin had always preached that family came before all else, ironically. And yet, here she was preparing to kill her own brother to safeguard her rule. Tywin had also taught her that a Lannister must never appear weak. Perhaps that was the lesson she had truly learned. The next day, she approached Tommen in his chambers. It was early, and Marjorie was not yet hovering at his side. Cersei found him reading a history book, a determined frown on his boyish face, as if trying to absorb the lineage of past kings. He looked up eagerly when she entered, but his smile faded at the sight of her grave expression. "My sweet boy," she began gently, "I have a task that only you as king can perform, and it will be difficult, but it must be done." He closed the book. "Mother," she sat beside him, taking his hand. "You know your Uncle Tyrion stands accused of murdering your brother Joffrey. Though the evidence is complicated, many still believe he was responsible. And your grandfather also died under suspicious circumstances, with some pointing to Tyrion's involvement. We have let him languish in the dungeons, but the time for final justice has come." Tommen's eyes widened in alarm. "You mean, you want me to order his execution?" She squeezed his hand. "There will be a short hearing, and the evidence will be presented. But yes, it is likely to end in a sentence of death." He recoiled, pulling his hand free. But Tyrion is my uncle. He always tried to be kind to me. I remember him giving me kittens once, when I was little." Cersei pursed her lips, recalling that memory. Tyrion had indeed given Tommen a small litter of kittens. She banished the thought. "I know this is hard, but Joffrey was your brother and he was our king. If Tyrion took his life, he must pay with his own. The realm demands justice." Tommen stared at the floor, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "But what if he's innocent?" Her stomach clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "The evidence is enough, Tommen. Trust me, I would not ask this of you if I had any doubt." She forced a note of tenderness into her tone. "You must be strong. This is the first true act of kingship that is yours alone. Father is gone, your grandfather is gone, and your Uncle Jaime cannot make this decision for you. You wear the crown. Will you defend your brother's memory?" Tommen swallowed, face pale. I will try. I'm just scared, Mother." She leaned in, kissing his cheek. "I will be with you. You only need to pronounce the sentence. The rest will be done by others, and then we can put this ugly chapter behind us." He nodded shakily, clearly conflicted, but yielding to her insistence. Cersei left him then, a mixture of relief and apprehension swirling in her chest. Tommen's reluctance might tear at him, but eventually, he would learn to set aside compassion for duty. It was a lesson every ruler had to learn. The next few days were a flurry of preparations. Qyburn quietly assembled a handful of so-called witnesses, while Cersei prepared the hall for a formal but brief hearing. She instructed the Goldcloaks to ensure that only a small crowd would be admitted. No need for a spectacle like the last time Tyrion stood accused. A select group of lords and ladies were invited, enough to lend gravity to the proceedings without inflaming the city. Jaime said little during this time, but Cersei knew he disapproved. She caught his eyes once or twice, filled with the kind of weariness that suggested he found this distasteful. But he did not openly defy her. If anything, he seemed resigned to the outcome. At last, the appointed day arrived. The throne room was arranged with Tommen seated on the Iron Throne, Cersei at his side. The gallery contained only a few onlookers: Mace Tyrell, Pycelle, Qyburn, Ser Meryn, and a handful of courtiers. Tyrion was brought forth in chains, flanked by 2 burly Goldcloaks. He looked thinner than before, though his mismatched eyes retained their cunning. He glanced around with a wry sneer. "Not as grand an audience as last time," he said. "I suppose you learned your lesson from the Viper's dance?" Cersei ignored the barb. Tommen stared at his uncle with obvious distress, but remained silent. The formalities began with Qyburn presenting the charges: regicide, the murder of King Joffrey, and suspicion of conspiracy in Lord Tywin's death. Tyrion listened, arms bound behind his back, occasionally letting out a soft grunt or a snort of derision. Qyburn called a jailer who testified that Tyrion had offered him gold in exchange for carrying messages to someone outside the castle. The jailer claimed it was proof Tyrion orchestrated Tywin's murder. Tyrion shook his head, muttering, "Absurd," under his breath. Next, a guardsman reported overhearing Tyrion curse Lord Tywin, vowing revenge, though the timeline was conveniently vague. Another witness repeated speculation from the wedding feast, how Tyrion had held the cup that killed Joffrey. Tyrion was finally allowed a chance to speak. He faced the throne, eyes flicking between Tommen and Cersei. "Your Grace," he said slowly, "I have no illusions that this hearing is merely pretense. My sister wants me dead, as she has for years, but I will say, for the record, that I had no hand in Joffrey's murder, nor do I know who killed Lord Tywin. It seems a vile act to kill a father, even one who despised you. I do not have the skill to slit a throat from inside a dungeon cell." Cersei felt a surge of dark satisfaction. Let him plead all he wanted. She knew the outcome was already decided. Tyrion continued, "As for bribing a jailer, yes, I did. I had hoped to send a plea for mercy to someone who might listen, but that is hardly the same as hiring an assassin. If this is the realm's justice, then we might as well skip to the part where I'm condemned." Tommen shifted on the throne, face pale. Cersei leaned in to whisper, "Now, my love, pass the sentence." The boy glanced at her, then at Tyrion, tears glistening in his eyes. At length he cleared his throat. His voice trembled but rang loud enough in the quiet hall. "Tyrion Lannister," he began, "you stand accused of murdering King Joffrey Baratheon and conspiring in the murder of Lord Tywin Lannister. Though the evidence may be contested, it is enough to prove guilt in the eyes of the crown. I hereby sentence you to death." A hush fell. Tyrion gazed at Tommen, then at Cersei, and gave a short, bitter laugh. "House Lannister shows its true colors again. Very well. Get on with it." Cersei stood, addressing the assembled onlookers. "The king has spoken. Tyrion Lannister shall be taken to the Black Cells and, at dawn, be put to death by the sword. May the Seven have mercy on his twisted soul." She could feel her heart pounding, a curious mix of triumph and unease. Tyrion was led away, his chains rattling on the floor. As the doors swung shut behind him, the onlookers dispersed, some bowing to Tommen, others to Cersei. Mace Tyrell wore a solemn mask, though she could sense his relief. No doubt he was pleased to see any threat to the crown eliminated. Pycelle was dabbing his eyes, though whether from sorrow or piety was unclear. Qyburn's expression was impassive. Jaime lingered near the throne, not looking at Cersei. She approached him, placing a hand on his arm. "It's done," she said quietly. He nodded stiffly, eyes fixed on the spot where Tyrion had stood. "Yes, it is." Then he turned away without another word, leaving the hall. She told herself it was for the best. Tyrion's death would close the chapter on Joffrey's murder and Tywin's suspicious demise. Let the city assume Tyrion arranged both. The lion that had overshadowed her was gone, and so soon would be the dwarf that might someday unravel the truth. That night, she did not sleep. She stood on her balcony, gazing out at the flickering lights of the city, listening to distant shouts and laughter. King's Landing never truly slept. She lifted a goblet of wine, sipping, tasting bitterness on her tongue. At dawn, Tyrion would die. Another piece of her family would vanish. Perhaps it was a fair exchange for absolute power. She reminded herself that Tywin would have done the same, that he had taught her to never let sentiment undermine purpose. Yet memories of Tyrion's clever japes and unexpected kindnesses haunted her, small specters that refused to let her rest. She inhaled the night air, forcing them away, telling herself she was now the true lion of House Lannister, unburdened by father or brother. Shortly before sunrise, she heard a commotion from the courtyard. A solitary rider galloped through the gates, disheveled, shouting for the Queen Regent. Alarmed, Cersei pulled on a cloak and rushed downstairs, flanked by 2 gold cloaks. The courtyard was dimly lit by torches. A stable boy tried to calm the lathered horse, while the rider, a panting messenger, bowed to Cersei. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice cold and imperious despite her pounding heart. The messenger caught his breath. "Your Grace, I come from the Black Cells. Tyrion Lannister. He has escaped." Cersei felt as though the world spun beneath her feet. She grabbed the man by the tunic. "What do you mean, escaped? How?" "He was taken from his cell. The jailer is dead, his throat cut. Another guard is missing. We searched the corridors, but there's no sign of him. We suspect he fled into the city, or someone smuggled him out." For a second, she could only stare, her mind whirling with disbelief and rage. Another father's death scene, a cut throat in the night. She heard a rush of blood in her ears. Tyrion had done it, or someone had done it for him. "Sound the alarm," she said in a voice that trembled with barely contained fury. "Lock down every gate. Search the city house by house if you must. I want him found. If he's not found, your heads will roll." The messenger paled and ran to carry out the order. Cersei turned to the gold cloaks, barking commands. "Summon the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Double the watch on every city gate, every ship at the docks. Tyrion Lannister must not leave King's Landing alive." They raced off, leaving Cersei alone in the courtyard. Her breath came in ragged bursts, fury surging. This was impossible. She had planned everything carefully, only to be thwarted at the last moment. Another echo of that night in the privy, when Tywin was taken swiftly and silently. Now Tyrion had vanished into the dark, a ghost escaping the noose she had fashioned for him. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. If Tyrion had truly escaped, he might be beyond her reach already. He might be forging a new alliance even now, or seeking refuge with Varys. Gods knew where the spider was lurking these days. The ramifications were staggering. And worst of all, if Tyrion suspected the truth about Tywin's death, he might one day wield that knowledge. She stormed through the courtyard, shouting for more guards, demanding that the city be turned upside down. Torchlight flickered on her furious face, and servants shrank back from her wrath. She thought of Jaime. Did he have a hand in this? No, she doubted it. Jaime's guilt would have been obvious, but there were others who might have aided Tyrion. Bronn, or some Sellswords, or even some cunning manipulator like Littlefinger. It was still possible Tyrion was hiding somewhere in the city. She would not stop until every alley, every tavern, every hidden tunnel was searched. The worst outcome would be if he escaped King's Landing altogether. Then he could reappear anywhere in Westeros, launching fresh intrigues against her. The sky lightened to a dull gray, heralding the rising sun. The city stirred with the approach of morning, unaware that a manhunt was about to sweep through its streets. Cersei felt the night's chill in her bones as she stood at the gate, watching gold cloaks rush out in squads. She spat a curse under her breath. If she had acted sooner, if she had not insisted on a hearing, Tyrion might already be headless. She would not let this setback define her reign. She was the Queen Regent, the true power in the realm. She had brought down Tywin Lannister and arranged Tyrion's downfall. Even if he slipped away, she would remain. The walls of King's Landing were thick with guards loyal to her. The Tyrells were still in her debt, and Tommen wore the crown at her bidding. No matter where Tyrion scurried, he could not overthrow her alone. But deep in her heart, an unease festered. Tyrion was cunning, resourceful, and now consumed with the knowledge that his sister had nearly had him executed. He would be her enemy forever, lurking in the shadows, perhaps even gleaning the secret of Tywin's true murderer. She sensed that her father's ghost might rise again, not in the city but in the shape of the brother she despised. She squared her shoulders, refusing to show any sign of weakness before the guards. Orders had been given, and the city would soon lock down. She would do whatever it took to recapture Tyrion, to end him once and for all. The memory of Tywin's lifeless body flickered in her mind, that final moment of triumph tainted now by the threat of discovery. She had not expected this twist, but she had faced worse challenges before. She reminded herself that a lioness cornered was at her most dangerous. She marched back into the Red Keep, already shouting for the small council to convene at once, summoning the captains of the Gold Cloaks, informing them that the city was under an unprecedented order of search and seize. The people would grumble, but fear would keep them compliant. She would find Tyrion or hound him to the ends of the earth if he fled. Even as she issued commands, she could not help imagining Tyrion slipping away on a small boat in the pre-dawn gloom, grinning at her fury. The idea stabbed at her pride. She forced herself to remain calm, to channel her anger into cold efficiency. She would show Westeros that no one escaped her wrath unscathed. A new day dawned over the city's rooftops, the rosy glow of morning falling upon streets soon to be filled with searching soldiers. And in the heart of it all, Cersei Lannister, the woman who had slain her father and nearly executed her brother, stood tall, her mind churning with possibilities. She would guard her throne and her son at any cost. If Tyrion lived, so be it. She would treat his survival as a challenge that sharpened her resolve. She was the queen. She had learned from the greatest manipulator the realm had ever seen, and she would not be undone by a man she considered a deformed shadow of House Lannister's glory. If war was required, she would wage war. If subterfuge, she would conspire. She had stepped beyond the point of no return the day she killed Tywin. She would continue onward, forging a reign of iron will and whispered threats. As dawn broke in earnest, she stared at the blazing red sky and recalled an old saying, "Red sun at morning, sailor take warning." Perhaps it was an omen of battles to come, of storms brewing in unseen corners. But she was Cersei of House Lannister, and no storm would sweep her away. She gripped the hilt of the jeweled dagger at her waist, the blade she sometimes wore for show. It was not the same dagger she had used on her father, that one she had disposed of, but the weight of steel comforted her all the same. The search began. The city's gates clanged shut. The Gold Cloaks roared out commands in the streets, and the Red Keep bristled with tension. Mace Tyrell and Pycelle arrived, eyes wide with concern, and Cersei told them Tyrion had fled his cell, that the traitor must be found. She told them it was the king's command that any who harbored Tyrion would face death. The small council scattered to spread word, mobilizing every resource. Jaime found her in the corridor outside Tommen's audience chamber, where she stood directing a group of knights. He reached out and touched her arm, his expression a mix of concern and resignation. "He's gone then," he said. "You won't find him easily." She shrugged his hand off, eyes flashing. "I will do whatever it takes. I will offer a fortune in gold for any clue. He can't have traveled far in the night. The gates have been sealed." Jaime gazed at her with an odd mix of pity and frustration. "Cersei, you're becoming father." She stiffened. "I am surpassing him. Now stand aside if you will not help." He sighed, but he stepped away. She left him there, ignoring the pang in her chest. There was no time for sentiment. If Tyrion had slipped through her fingers, she would pay any price to recapture him. For he was the one remaining link to the truth about Tywin's death, and the one man cunning enough to guess the truth. That day, she strode through the halls like a storm, the cloak of her gown swirling behind her. Servants and lords alike stepped back in fear. She radiated the ferocity of a cornered lioness, daring anyone to challenge her. Tywin's murder had given her freedom, and now that freedom was under threat by a man she had once called brother, she would not rest until her victory was absolute. Sunset found her on a high balcony, surveying the city once more, scanning the horizon for any sign of ships leaving port. In the distance, she saw only the golden reflection of sunlight on the waters of Blackwater Bay, the sprawl of the city in the shadows of twilight. Somewhere out there, Tyrion might be hiding, or perhaps he was already gone. Her hands tightened on the stone railing. She vowed that if he reemerged to challenge her, she would strike him down with the same finality she had shown their father. She had never felt more certain that power was her birthright, nor more aware of how precarious that power could be. but she would keep it, even if she had to burn every last shred of mercy from her heart. And so the game continued, the pieces rearranging themselves on the board. Cersei stood at the center, controlling as many moves as she could while shadows shifted around her. She told herself that she was ready for whatever came next. She had proven she could kill the mightiest man in the realm. What was a brother to that? Night fell, torches lit the city walls, and the search pressed on through labyrinthine alleys. But Tyrion was nowhere to be found. Cersei withdrew to her chamber, seething, determined that on the morrow, her orders would intensify. She would post rewards, threaten punishments, do anything to force him into the open. In the darkness, as she lay in her bed, alone, she felt the old whisper of Tywin's voice in her memory, reminding her that a Lannister should never show fear. She let that memory fade, replaced by the image of his blood on her hands. There was no place for fear in her heart now, only cunning and resolve. If Tyrion returned one day to upend her rule, she would be ready. She clutched the covers, inhaling slowly. She was Cersei Lannister, a lioness who had devoured the lion. She would devour the dwarf as well, if he dared cross her path again. That was her final promise to herself before she closed her eyes, letting uneasy dreams claim her. Dreams in which she stood alone in the Red Keep's throne room, blade in hand, her father's blood dripping from the walls, and Tyrion's mocking laughter echoing through the shadows. Yet come morning, she would rise anew, spine stiffened by her unwavering ambition, steeled by the knowledge of how far she had already gone. The realm was hers to shape, and no man, no father, no brother, no king, would take that from her. She had killed Tywin first, claimed the seat of power, and she intended to hold it until the bitter end, no matter what storms or traitors lay ahead.